Inverting the typical narrative of artistic progression, Jean Hélion went from painting like this to painting like this, which is a good story but not quite the whole picture. Throughout his life, Hélion would weave in and out of a strange, completely distinctive and constantly evolving hybrid of figuration and abstraction. The apparently neutral but slightly disconcerting realism of images like autumn leaves represents only one extreme position in his long, hard look at the art of painting. Looking long and hard is something Hélion practiced at many levels, from studying the particulars of nuts and net curtains in still lifes like The Snack, to condensing and considering the past 10 years of his output in the 1953 picture, The Studio, in which, coincidentally, The Snack makes an appearance. The Studio is a kind of mid-career moment of taking stock, a little like Duchamp's retrospective in a suitcase, La Boîte aux Valises. It incorporates mini reproductions of several key paintings, while almost every detail alludes to some aspect of his work, recalling certain series or recurring motifs. An iron bench has been dragged into the studio for reference, turning it into a public park, somewhere to watch the world go by. A hat sits on a paper, as if one of Hélion's newspaper readers from the 40s has been comically flattened. The unswept floor and the monumental canvas with its back turned point the way to Le Grand Luxembourg, already under development. The collector Pierre Brugier examines the goods, recalling Hélion's street scenes of shop fronts and vendors. Indeed, the giant canvas behind him is actually Balthus' Passage du Commerce, if you want to talk about intertextuality. His partner, Pegeen, mirrors the nude of Back to Breads, wearing a red skirt, like the one he'd paint in the following year's Pegeen in her studio. Even the skylight at the very top suggests Hélion's rooftop pictures, or the attic musicians he'd continued to paint into the 1960s. The studio is a meditation on where he's been and where he's going, but it's also a kind of grand affirmation of the representational turn his painting had taken, which many considered foolish. The picture has a sequel of sorts in the exhibition of 1934. A reminiscence across the decades, it finds Hélion reflecting on the beginning of his career, then in its initial abstract phase. The painting measures the hermetic world of aesthetics against the messier world of human interactions, the world of pictures against the world of people and things. Hélion's signature hangs in a frame, like a helpful wall sign, a kind of mediator between the two. It's hard not to see the exhibition of 1934 as a kind of knowing restaging of Gustave Courbet's The Painter's Studio, or, to give it its full title, The Painter's Studio, a real allegory summing up 7 years of my artistic and moral life. Though in Hélion's case, it's 45 years he's trying to sum up. There's a sense of both artists trying to cram the whole world into the picture. As with Courbet's Studio, the exhibition of 1934 is a slightly preposterous picture. It shows the progression from novice on the left, piously kneeling before the altar of abstraction, to the bustle of argument, critique, and discourse, chin-stroking, theorizing in the central group, and finally to the contemplation of humble objects, the vase of daisies which the gallery attendant seems more interested in than the bouquet of figures to her right. Unlike the limelight-hogging Courbet, Hélion largely leaves himself out of both the exhibition and the studio. In the exhibition of 1934, we simply find his name nailed to the wall, set aside like a placeholder for an absent dinner guest. Similarly, the small indication of a self-portrait in the studio is practically negligible, though it sits tellingly near the stove, the same position which Hélion himself occupies in The Painter, a companion piece to the studio from the same year. The prominent L shape of the stovepipe recalls paintings like Corot's Woman Seated Before an Easel, a mandolin in her hand. Again, the studio here is a network of interconnecting rectangles, a kind of picture-making factory. It's unclear whether the woman is meant to be the painter or a model standing in for the artist. Either way, her head connects with the stovepipe, almost as if she were a live conduit plugged into the studio equipment, her hand completing the circuit by touching the unfinished canvas. The stove is a kind of metaphor for the artist's mind, and for the studio as an extension of the artist's mind, a picture-thinking tool, a place of recirculation, recombustion. The studio provides its own grist to the mill, its own fuel to the furnace, its own self-sustaining system. It's a motif Cézanne also seized on in an early picture, the stove surrounded by a constellation of small paintings and palettes. Facing the open stove in the bottom corner of Hélion's studio, around the place where we'd normally find a signature, is a portable set of drawers supporting palette, paints and brushes. The drawers allude to the picture's play between flatness and depth, its nesting of images within images, spaces pulled out or shut away at the painter's convenience. The stacked compartment looks like the bellows of an upturned harmonium, yet another allusion to the studio as both a place of recirculation and an instrument to be played. Like practically everything in these pictures, the drawers are a kind of meta-painting grace note, underlining the materials and conditions of the image's own manufacture. Rather than a plaque on the wall, Hélion's avatar in this case is a box of tricks, a magician's cabinet, a busker's organ, all of which are metaphors for the studio, as much as they are extended metaphors for painting themselves. Of course, intertextual or self-referential games like this can quickly become tiresome, meaningless. So what makes for a healthy intertextuality, a healthy, self-sustaining practice? Hélion's return to Paris after the war was a return to a world of meaning, to represented ideas and images, everyday events and scenarios, but also improbable nudes, or equally improbable still lives of pumpkins and skulls, subjects which have very little to do with the daily routines and rituals he loved, and a whole lot more to do with the routines and rituals of art. Hélion constantly both declares and dissolves the distinction between art and life, so much so that art itself becomes a frequent subject. In à rebours, or backwards, an abstract painting is displayed in a shop window, while an artistically nude model spills out onto the street. Between the two, a painter sells his wares. It's an image of displacement and metamorphosis, of the transference between public and private space, art and life, inseparable from his shop window mannequins, his flea markets, his pictures of bread and pumpkins, which we watch being purchased from vendors and taken into the studio only to be sent back out as paintings. Painting for Hélion is like a revolving door through which life comes and goes in both directions, a revolving door through which people and things undergo a startling Clark Kent-like transformation. Part of this transformative effect is based on repetition. Recurring visual elements become motifs, which are then picked up and deployed across multiple pictures in a theoretically endless process of recombination, each equation yielding different results, different emphases and potential meanings. Hélion had an extremely fluid morphology, managing to juggle many of the same motifs across several decades, while keeping things complicated for himself by always throwing in new ones. Yet he also went through a period of repeating a single motif within the one picture. From around 1955 to 65, he produced incredibly seductive study paintings, single canvases with multiple versions of the same subject scattered seemingly at random. A woman sits on a chair. She sits on it again, to her left, and once more slightly further to her left. They're in what looks like a sparsely furnished, roughly octagonal attic space, lit by daylight from above. The first woman seems pretty desolate, lost in thought. The woman farthest from her appears more resigned, or is trying to. The woman in the middle could be a mediator. She's the only one attempting to make eye contact. It could be a falling out between three sisters, perhaps with the same faint echo of Cinderella which haunts Hélion's pumpkins. Today, it looks like group therapy. They're all sitting in exactly the same position, yet each one has a different mood and a different relationship with each other. We wonder how this person ended up multiplied and divided at the same time. A woman in a cardigan stands twice, on either side of her own statue, refusing to look at it. She consciously avoids imitating its deferential pose. The same woman is watched over by her own portrait, or a magic mirror on the wall. We hardly ever take paintings like this literally. We understand that they're a means to an end, a way of exploring the possibilities of a composition or studying a subject from multiple perspectives. But then, why should we take any depictive image to be anything other than what it is, or what it seems to show? Why should we read meaning into them? Why is it so hard not to? These are issues latent in any Hélion, but in the study sheets they take on a life of their own. Each image he repeats gains something in its multiplicity, has its own take on the subject and on the art form. This pumpkin appears 3 times, as if following the fairy tale rule of 3s. Yet it refuses to play any games of transformation. There's nothing of what Darkle Suvin called the great pumpkin antics of fantasy. The panels suggest progression, as if it were a comic strip, but instead there's a haunting sense of stasis. It reaffirms the stillness of still life. The only thing that moves is the light and perhaps the curtain, disturbed by a breeze. This time a woman draws the curtain. The outside world is blanked out. The room itself shrinks. Her world is revealed or concealed, opened up or shut down at will, as if it was something she could put in a box, tuck away at the back of a drawer. The picture puts its own spin on the interiority of the interior nude, its themes of intimacy, proximity, and privacy. A skull sits on a circular table. Again, and again. The top of the cranium's been sawn off and sits like a lid, as if the rest of the skulls, tables, and rooms could fit inside each other like a Matryoshka doll. Pretty chilling when we consider that the biggest skull they're all held within is really the viewer's own. Another series of tables carrying skulls march toward us like the animated buckets and brooms in Fantasia, getting closer, more distinct. It's a unique compositional rethink of the Vanitas picture. Time and death literally proceeding toward the viewer just as they stretch out into the distance. A plough sits in a field, thinking about the grass and soil below and the ocean beyond. It remains anchored to the ground, while the sea is as unfathomable an abstraction as the sky above. A little monochrome of the plough sits on the horizon like a distant galleon. In this and related pictures like Vanitas with Dead Leaf, the studies run along the top and bottom of the canvas, like reference sketches pinned to a drawing board or keyframes clipped to an animation cell. In a 1984 interview, Hélion cryptically referred to them as a commentary on the painting, representing the shuttling between the mind and the thing made. It's certainly ambiguous whether they were actually part of the painting process at all, or whether they merely alluded to the idea of it, just as it's hard to determine at which point in the process they were actually painted, whether he had all the tryouts pre-planned, or whether he added them in afterwards. More convincing as genuine studies are his explorations of the human hand. Yet many of these also have a pictorial power of their own, exploring themes of tenderness, self-consciousness, frenzy, an extreme landscape format, suggesting the hands of passengers busying themselves across a metro car, perhaps. A sliver of fabric evoking a bird about to attack, the hand like a close-up of its claws. The same hand transformed into one of defence, intervention by its relation to another. In the hands of Claire Gall, an image of entwined hands and wrists nestles inside another image of entwined hands and wrists. This negative space they leave is shaped like a chalice, a further allusion to self-containment. It's also a Christian symbol, which, along with the cramped conditions, might be partly why the picture feels like a confession box. One palm is raised, disturbing the symmetry, as if the image were on the verge of opening up, breaking out of its cocoon. It's only a minor oil study on paper, but it arguably has a lot of the same psychological and semantic complexity of pictures like Gwen John's Dorelia in a Black Dress, or the slightly Hélionesque preening by the contemporary painter Caroline Walker. And actually, Hélion can appear very contemporary himself. His particular kind of self-awareness is way ahead of its time and very much out of step with mainline 50s and 60s modernism. The study sheets especially walk a very postmodern, even post-conceptual line between playing out an actual process of painterly observation and a sustained deconstruction of it. The resemblance between this study of a chestnut branch and a late work by Sylvia Mangold is far more than aesthetic coincidence. There's a balance in each between self-consciousness and self-effacement, observation and abstraction. Both pictures employ a kind of ambient, all-over composition which nevertheless calls attention to the very idea of pictorial organisation, pictorial selection and decision-making. The chestnut fragments in the Hélion are repeated to such an unnecessary extent that they almost reassemble into the image of a tree, the buds and branches poking at the idea of being an unfinished picture rather than a series of disconnected sketches. Like the Mangold, it's a meditation on the piecemeal nature of human perception, on the piecemeal nature of pictures versus the endlessly unfolding continuousness of the physical world. Hélion maintained that his study paintings were just that, studies, but taking them as they are, it's very surprising just how much they hold together, how much they seem to work as works of art. Maybe he just couldn't help himself. As the poet John Ashbery noted, it's all part of the curious charm of Hélion's art, in which the practical and the mysterious sit side by side without infringing on each other. Admittedly, a lot of this also depends on the temperament of the viewer. How much we might want to listen to the artist and not the work, trust the teller, not the tale. The fact that the oil studies are more or less confined to the period 1955 to 65 certainly paints them much more as a discrete body of work, rather than the more strictly practical, multi-viewpoint pastel or charcoal drawings which he'd make continually throughout his career. While ambiguous in status, perhaps even to Hélion himself, it's a shame they're only sparingly included in exhibitions and catalogues, that they still gain very little critical attention, perhaps suffering from the often arbitrary distinction between preparatory and finished work. On the other hand, the study sheet is a common enough painterly artefact, a tool more than a work of art as such, and not something we should read too much into. But when we look at Edouard Vuillard's Carton d'étude, or study card, a painting from 1934, well past his prime by most accounts, do we simply see a sheet of studies, or do we see an ingenious allegory of the various painterly genres as they jostle for space? The endless task of translating the world into pictures? Might we also see a Hélionesque studio portrait in the most literal sense? The artist or dealer holding up a big turquoise canvas behind a vase of real flowers on a real table, a mirror beside him to the left, a little painting of a hauntingly receding hallway to the right, the rooms nested like the compartments in Hélion's mobile drawer cabinet. All the individual studies need here are a few shadows and highlights on their edges, and we'd have a straightforwardly coherent space. Perhaps even a late career return to the visual imagination of Vuillard's disorientating patchwork interiors from the previous century. In the same way, it's hard to see the distinction, really, between Hélion's multi-study paintings and the endlessly repeating and recombining motifs of the more substantial compositions. They seem to operate in the same general area, reiterating Hélion's natural skepticism, his belief in doubt and dissatisfaction as driving forces. Like his oeuvre at large, they raise the question of whether any picture is really much more than a study. The most beautiful picture is no more than a nasty little scrap of a dream, he wrote in a notebook of 1965. Throughout his career, he remained very conscious of how each picture or series related to the wider body of work, and how much a given painterly approach could gain by the presence of its alternative. Planning a retrospective in 1969, Pierre Brugier told the artist, "One really needs to have all your paintings." Hélion would have surely agreed. The study sheets are just the clearest example of his attitude toward finished pictures as being only one in a series of options, a series of possibilities or positions of roads taken and not taken. Part of the meta-meaning of Hélion's oeuvre is the development of the oeuvre itself. Each picture is both question and answer to the next. And as much as the oeuvre is its own meta-commentary, it's also an implicit meta-commentary on the art of painting in all its aspects. So much so that he can take the idea of the study sheet and treat it as a pictorial subgenre in and of itself, a distinct painterly idea to be tested and explored, with its own unique way of disrupting the fictive space of the picture surface, which is all fascinating in Hélion's hands, but it does raise the question, why should we care? What do all these internal games have to do with anything? In her 1983 book, The Art of Describing, Svetlana Alpers argues that Dutch art of the 17th century represents a broad shift away from the textual culture of the 15th and 16th century Italy towards a more secularized visual culture, a culture much more concerned with things and appearances and with everyday life than with the higher realms of meaning and significance. Yet 17th century Dutch and Flemish painting is also where the art form starts to become extremely self-referential. Having moved away from the church as its prime source and patron, painting perhaps unsurprisingly became much more self-conscious about its own identity, playing games with illusion and depth, symbols and meanings, the real and the artificial, layering paintings within paintings and so on. At its worst, like any metafictional work, this can be pretty shallow, clever for cleverness' sake. But at its best, this self-referentiality remains deeply latent, allowing the art of painting to both inform and be informed by the subject, whether resonating in harmony and equivalence or clashing in discord and antithesis. For example, if David Teniers the Younger's tavern scenes have a functional meaning, then surely it's as broad satire. The foolish ways of foolish peasants, or something along those lines. But in the way these pictures are composed, not to mention their very Hélion-like approach to remixing a given repertoire of motifs, they're about much more than this. They're about the material cycles and processes of imbibing, smoking, drinking, urinating, and by extension of cooking, fermenting, clay firing, painting. But they're also about the cycles of gathering and dispersing socially, work and play, spending time, energy and money, people coming and going while triangles of daylight sundial around the room. They explore the tavern as a space, the picture as a box. Windows and hatches suddenly open, people look in, look out. Simple drawings are pinned to the walls, the corners of which curl up from the humidity, as if to demonstrate their own hinterland between 2 and 3 dimensions, flatness and volume. They explore the language of objects, containers, garments, tools, which become extensions of, or metaphors for the human body. The figures are like giant vessels, constantly being emptied and refilled. Hats are hung on the back of chairs to claim the space, becoming objects of substitution, imbued with their wearer's essence, in a similar way to the slightly caricatured portrait sketches on the walls. There's a darkly comical rhyme here between the drinker's skullcap and the lid of his tankard. He's slowly drinking himself to oblivion, running his well dry. Another figure looks up at the portrait on the wall, cupped between hat and drawing, just as the older man sits between cap and lid. As with the pile of empty clothes, there's a sense of human life as a transitory thing, a temporary occupation of the physical world, of physical form. This triangular arrangement of empty pots and shells, spoon, stool, mahlstick, is like a crude approximation of the pipe smoker on the left. Like Hélion's set of drawers, it's also a cipher for the elusive artist who's disappeared in a flash, leaving only his signature and an empty shoe. As in Hélion's studio of 1953, the artist present is as palpable as his absence. The painter, an invisible arranger who is everywhere and nowhere. All of these ideas and motifs dynamically resonate against one another, considering how human beings occupy and inhabit spaces, and equally how they occupy themselves by considering how they occupy pictures. They divide the rectangle, play games with flatness, depth, light, and dark, proximity and distance, which are not merely games, but which question, existentially, the walls and limits of human experience. The enclosures we roam in, those that we build for shelter. In the case of Teniers' landscapes, which pull out for the wide shot. Outdoor games, areas of pasture or construction sites below massive skies. They seem to ask, what does all this work and play mean? What does it amount to? There's a sense in which Teniers is dealing with the spiritual void left when painting's patronage, its reason for being, moves from the dominantly ecclesiastic to the mercantile, that painting has to look for or to find meaning within its own form, within its own arrangements. And when he depicts the vast collection of Archduke Leopold Wilhelm, we're looking at the same kind of play between art and illusion, multiple and micro, flatness and depth, fragmentation and completion, that we see in Hélion's studio or in Vuillard's study card. It's the same bots of tricks taken to extreme lengths. The gallery pictures are really just a more elaborate, operatic restaging of the windows and caricatures pinned to his chamberpiece taverns. In their own way, Teniers' small tavern pictures have as much to say about the art of painting as Velázquez celebrated Las Meninas from around 20-odd years later. But perhaps they have more to say about people and things, about life as it's lived by the commoner. They certainly wear their self-referential qualities more lightly. Like Hélion's study pictures, they allude to the art of painting without explicitly showing the artist at work. They allow the sequestered space of the tavern to suggest the alchemist's laboratory, or perhaps even the painter's studio, which had only recently entered art as a subject in itself. As painting simultaneously became more interested in the everyday world of people at work, and equally fascinated with its own artifice, it was only a matter of time before artists began to explore their own workplaces. Rembrandt's depiction of the lone painter, faced with the blankness of a new canvas and the silence of an empty room, might not accurately reflect the 17th century reality of studios busy with students and assistants, but it does reflect the dangers of art's self-absorption, the danger of the studio as a kind of solipsistic echo chamber cut off from the world. In Teniers' hands, the tavern becomes a kind of substitute studio, a functional space able to facilitate painting's indoor games with light and objects, but equally able to accommodate the more boisterous theatre of daily life, the studio's antithesis, and what in some ways aspires towards. In the same way, Hélion's studio aspires to be a kind of city park or market square, a place of life and activity as much as a place for study and observation, an antechamber a little closer to the world outside. In complete contrast, the painter totally inverts the studio's balance of contemplation and bustle. Here the artist stands alone, at the centre of a shrinking universe. The place has become ponderous and barren. The picture's turned away, the painter temporarily at an impasse. Like Rembrandt's lone artist, he's been left to start again from scratch. The two paintings represent the day and night of the atelier, an almost seasonal cycle of burnout and rejuvenation. It's a balance Teniers turns on its head, finding a certain chill in overabundance and a certain warmth in the Spartan. His gallery pictures are as vast, as impersonal as his taverns are modest and intimate, and yet each also represents a valid position on the relative distance between art and life. The taverns are clearly painted by someone who spent an equal amount of time in the studio, enough time to see one in the other, while the Royal Collection pictures are a universe away in scale and opulence, an artificial world pretty far removed from everyday reality. Blatantly theatrical productions, they stress the folly of pictorial oversaturation, the reduction of images to mere things, as much as they emphasise the picture frame, the gilded boundary between art and life. In between these extremes, Teniers paints his wife and young son at home. Kitchen interior is a related yet way more grounded picture of comfort and plenty, in which the decorative and nourishing still life objects arranged around the room serve a similar function to their painted counterparts scattered across the picture. In the dazzlingly painted foodstuffs and in telling details like the decorative bird on the ceramic bowl, there's an implied equivalence between the painted home comfort and the home comfort itself, a substitution of substance and sustenance that goes back to the still lifes on the walls of Roman villas. There's a parallel drawn between the elaborately prepared food being taken from the kitchen to the table and paintings taken from the studio to the home or to the picture gallery, paintings garlanded and hung like the prize geese, the stuff of the world laid out for our delectation. In many ways, it's a proto-Hélionesque picture which dissolves the distance between the spaces of work and display, art and reality. The family portrait in the centre might as well be surrounded by still life paintings with an oversized genre picture on the back wall. While he never depicts the picture-making process directly, there's a sense in which Teniers' paintings explore the very real relationships formed between art and life, which are as complex and various as any relationship. They are never merely trite paintings simply about the art of painting. Similarly, they are never merely trite paintings simply about the coarse artlessness of life, as they might be in an Adrian Brouwer or a Jan Steen, for example. Though it should be said, this isn't a universal opinion. Teniers' reputation has been as tellingly erratic as Hélion's at times. Throughout his classic book on genre, Landscape, Portrait, Still Life, Their Origin and Development, Max J. Friedlander gives him a sustained critical trashing. Teniers, he said, is insipid, programmatically imitating earthier artists like his predecessor Brouwer, yet passing their motifs through the sieve of his politeness and niceness, changing Brouwer's gold into small coin in a long career of mechanical production. Worse, he goes on to say that Teniers' subjects are carried out without psychological interest, without humour, with affability at best, the figures haphazardly thrown together in unconvincing circumstances, concluding that the artist has acquired a prestige out of all proportion to his talent. For Friedlander, Teniers' recycling of motifs is a sign of unimaginative laziness, while his generic scenarios of seemingly little discernible incident have a lack of humanity, a lack of depth. Yet it's arguably the constant Hélionesque remixing of their motifs which allows Teniers' pictures a greater thematic range, their ambivalence which gives them a far deeper humanity. Teniers' recurring cast of objects and motifs gain meaning and significance by their placement in the frame, by their relation to one another, and by their implicit relation to the art of painting. Paradoxically, it's their self-referential qualities which allow them to say more about art and life, their internal rhymes and rhythms which allow them to push outward, their pictorial compression and economy which allows them to be way more thematically expansive. Unlike Steen, and arguably going much further than Brouwer, who had his moments, there's a sense that the very act of picture making, the transformation of the generic scene into a picture, is what allows it to transcend its limitations. Without depicting it explicitly, Teniers' paintings are always about the transformative picturing and painting process, though he's rarely credited in histories of the art form's self-awareness, eclipsed as he is by his contemporary, Velázquez. A much more explicitly allegorical artist, Velázquez does show the picture-making process, the painting of a royal portrait in Las Meninas, the weaving of a tapestry in The Spinners. Each can be read as a very different but equally valid model of the studio, or rather, the studio as the metaphorical threshold between art and world. Las Meninas takes place in a makeshift studio set up within one of the picture galleries of the palace, the curation of which would have been part of Velázquez's royal duties. It therefore offers a pictorial conflation of studio and museum, tradition and the individual, art and life. Yet in some ways it's as rigidly cordoned and hierarchical as the life at court it depicts. It literally shows the world being portioned and put into frames boxed up in a series of ever-decreasing rectangles. Las Meninas is a picture of the world being frozen and fixed in place, hermetically sealed, while The Spinners is a picture of the world unbottled, opening up, unfolding, caught in the process of being constantly revealed, renewed, and respun. Its language of circles, loops, and cycles could almost be read as a critique of Las Meninas' language of rectangles, its sense of motion and cooperation, a critique of that picture's aloof sense of stasis and order. In Las Meninas' image of the painter at court, we could easily see the artist in his studio, or the prisoner in his cell, cut off from the outside world, trapped in what Antonio Palomino called the golden prison of art in his 1724 biography of the painter. In The Spinners, however, art and life, world and picture are continuous, dynamically interwoven. Like Teniers' taverns, it's much more of a workplace than a world of courtly hierarchy and order. In fact, it makes a pretty big point of upturning its own visual and thematic hierarchies. In a form of meta-commentary, the painting alludes to the story of Arachne, a mortal woman who challenged the goddess Minerva to a weaving competition. In Ovid's version of the story, Arachne proceeds to weave tapestries which tell tales of the gods, mirroring the dense nesting of narratives within narratives throughout the metamorphoses. Just as the tapestry in the background of The Spinners layers paintings within paintings, remixing elements of Rubens' treatment of the story, a copy of which can be seen hung in the gallery of Les Meninas, and Titian's painting of Europa and the Bull, a painting which was both part of the royal collection and a subject woven by Arachne during the contest, as depicted in the Rubens. Keeping track of the reference at play here is pretty headache-inducing. But more importantly, the humble genre scene becomes a grand mythology painting open to multiple readings. Roles are reversed. The mortal women become like the Fates, who spin the threads of human life, while the gods are miniaturized and diminished, becoming mere images, just as the royal couple are in Les Meninas' famously ambiguous mirror. There's an infinite loop between foreground and background, narrative and meta-narrative in The Spinners. It never settles definitively into being either a picture of people depicting the story of Arachne and Minerva, or the story of Arachne and Minerva itself. As in Ovid, the telling is part of the tale. Form and content are interwoven. Today, The Spinners looks a lot like a film studio or a projection room. Media and technology might have changed, but we still feel the image being fed through the wheel, the mental and physical processing required in bringing images to screens. As Svetlana Alpers eloquently put it in her later book, The Vexations of Art, in Las Meninas, Velázquez depicts himself at work in the studio. In The Spinners, he is imagining the experience of it. If Las Meninas is a picture about pictures, then The Spinners is a picture about the stage rigging behind them. The ostensible realism of Las Meninas shows the myth of painting as time arrested, as a mirror to the world, while the mythological, allegorical Spinners shows the messier reality. But, as Hélion's studio shows, the myth and reality are absolutely compatible. Velázquez's spinning wheel is the 17th century equivalent of Hélion's stove. The rectangular puzzle box of Las Meninas' picture gallery, a distant ancestor to his drawer cabinet. The cycle and the container, the box and the conduit, two models of the studio, of the relationship between art and life, which are never mutually exclusive but which spin in perpetual orbit. This is a pretty funny picture from 1590 by the French painter François Bunel the Younger, showing the confiscation of the contents of an artist's studio, perhaps to pay off a debt. It essentially depicts an invasion of the studio by the outside world. But like Hélion's A Rebours, it can also be read the other way around. Instead of showing art's invasion of the world, paintings plundering of visible reality. Its transformation of the world into a procession of rectangles. It's a kind of painterly allegory in the form of a visual feedback loop. The figures fueling the picture-making machine while they try to empty it. As with Hélion, the traffic runs both ways. The image can be flipped and inverted, spun like a shop sign. In fact, it's far more complex and a far more insightful meditation on art and life than Watteau's widely celebrated satire, The Shop Sign of Jacinthe, which it bears a definite resemblance to. A picture which is much more about the absurd distance between art and reality, the cul-de-sac of the picture surface. Bunel's studio is a bottomless chest. Clark's trying to catalogue the contents, while the removal men keep finding more and more canvases, almost too many to carry. Everything they touch seems to turn to pictures. Paintings spread like a plague. One man even becomes a walking mass of rectangles. Everything can become a picture. Everything is food for the rectangle. Even the scene before us has become a picture in a frame. It's a painting which speaks of art's continuity with the wider world, the wider field of human experience which art must necessarily participate in. Even the monastic contemplation chamber of the studio, to which Bunel gives a theatrically invisible fourth wall, open onto the street. Just like Hélion. Just like Watteau. Bunel's confiscation may be separated from Hélion's shops and market stalls by nearly 400 years, but they're very much on the same avenue. For both artists, easel painting is an endless process of emptying and restocking, boxing and shifting, give and take, an endless trade negotiation with the physical world. Already in 1590, in what must be among the first paintings of a painter's studio, we can see Teniers' comedy of rooms, people and objects. Hélion's revolving door. The world ran through hoops, put in frames, played out in a comedy of rectangles.